Hi. For I think all of you know me, but I'm Nancy Wolanski with Grantmakers Council of Rhode Island, and we are going to have a Zoomcast today. Not really sure what to call it, but because we are not having funder briefings during the last 2 months of the summer, there are still a lot of important policy issues taking place that it's important for funders to know about. So I wanted to host a couple of these conversations that you can watch at your leisure. We have one today on voting rights in Rhode Island, and we are going to be having one next week on the child tax credit and accessing that with economic opportunity funders. Amy Nagel is going to be joining me for that. So I wanted to welcome John Marion, who is the head of Common Cause Rhode Island and was a fabulous partner to GCRI in the census work that many of you helped to fund. So first of all, thank you, John, for your partnership with that.
Thank you.
And Common Cause has done yeoman's work on the issues around voting rights in Rhode Island. And so they are currently continuing to advocate for more accessible voting in Rhode Island. So I wanted to have John first talk about what the current voting law landscape is in Rhode Island. So if nothing changes, what the next election will look like. And then we'll move on to some kind of what's on the horizon and where we could be moving in the future with some additional advocacy. So John, can you just talk some about kind of the current voting rights landscape in Rhode Island and how it compares to other parts of the country?
Sure. And thank you for having me. And thank you to your funders for their work on the census. It was huge, and we were, successful in many respects. So it's incredibly important that the community came together to do that effort. So voting rights in Rhode Island. We had a really successful election in 2020. About 507,000 Rhode Islanders voted, which was, although not the highest percentage, it was the biggest number, if that makes sense, of voters in the state's history. And election day went almost flawlessly, which we can't say about some prior elections. There were some pretty significant problems in 2012, for instance, on election day. But right now, in 2021, we're likely to go back to what elections look like prior to the pandemic. And that's mostly because the General Assembly hasn't made many of the changes that were made in 2020 for the pandemic permanent. So as of right now, if you think about the three primary ways people vote, on election day, early, in person, or by a mail ballot. So prior to the pandemic in 2016, about 93% of Rhode Islanders voted on election day. So it's part of the reason why we'd often have actually a lot of lines, particularly in bigger polling places in neighborhoods that have historically higher voter turnout. We would see some lines. And by contrast, only 40% of people voted on election day in 2020. We're probably going to go back not to 93% if nothing changes, but it's going to be a much higher than 40%. In part because what happened last year was demand was taken off of election day and put on two other forms of voting. One was early voting. Rhode Island doesn't have early voting that we can really call early voting. We have something called emergency mail balloting. During the pandemic, the Assembly, the legislature, made a change to the law that made that easier. Because that used to be a paper process where you actually had to fill out an emergency mail ballot and put it in an envelope. The Assembly last July made a change to the law that you could fill out an emergency mail ballot and put it into a voting machine. And about 30% of Rhode Island voters did that last year. That will stay the same And I anticipate there'll be a lot of demand for that after the pandemic because we see that in other states. Other states have been migrating toward that for decades, and Rhode Island really hadn't moved in that direction. The more drastic change is going to be a return to fewer people voting by mail. Historically, very, very few Rhode Islanders voted by mail. We're talking, single digits. And that was because we have some of the more restrictive mail ballot laws in the country. So Rhode Island requires that every mail ballot be accompanied by the signature of 2 witnesses or a notary public. There are only 2 states that require that besides Rhode Island, Alabama, and North Carolina. So we, by that measure, have, among the most restrictive mail ballot laws in the United States. That was lifted during the pandemic, first by an executive order and then through a settlement because of some litigation. But that has gone back into place because Governor McKee has said he's not going to issue any more executive orders waiving that. So I would expect post-pandemic, without any other changes, we will see a return to large numbers voting on Election Day. And although some of that demand will be sort of siphoned off by people who vote early, although what remains to be seen is a lot of the larger cities and towns, including Cranston and Providence, offered weekend voting during the pandemic to kind of spread out the demand, and they're not required to do that. So we'll see if they continue to do that after the pandemic. But one of the big lessons of last year, and something we know from other states who have very different voting models, is that if you spread out voting over a longer period of time, fewer things go wrong on Election Day. Election Day is historically sort of a high stakes game of making sure everything goes right for those 12 hours on that day, or 13 hours. And if they don't, it's hard to make corrections, right? But if you see a problem during early voting, you can make corrections. Or if you see, huge demand in early voting, the stress comes off of Election Day. So spreading that out was very good for Rhode Island.
And in terms of the mail-in ballots, you have to get the notary or the witnesses. Will it be back to no excuse, or do you have to have an excuse too?
Yeah, so Rhode Island, again, is a little unique among the United States. We have what lawyers say is an excuse to vote by mail, but in practice, it's no excuse. So without getting too technical, there are 4 categories of mail ballots, but there is a box you can check, any voter can check that says I may not be at my polling place on Election Day. And that's why I have to vote in mail ballot. And so de facto, no excuse mail ballots, although technically that is an excuse. So that's not the barrier. The barrier historically to larger numbers voting mail ballots have been that you have to have the witnesses or notary signature, and it's a paper process to request a mail ballot. So, one of the things we saw last year was there are a whole host of states who have drastically expanded the use of mail ballots, some to the point of sending every voter a mail ballot automatically, like Colorado, and Oregon, and Washington State. They had to make almost no changes for the pandemic. Rhode Island had to make drastic changes because we had one of the most restrictive schemes for requesting and voting a mail ballot. We did a pretty good job of transitioning. There were some major hiccups in the June presidential primary, but because that was largely uncontested, I think people gave election officials a pass. But by September and November, mail ballots went pretty well, and a number of changes were made internally, how they process them. But the Secretary of State sent every voter in the state paper application, right? so that, really encouraged people to vote mail ballots. That's not going to happen anymore. She has said she's not going to do that. That costs about $500,000 every time that office sends those applications. So, I would expect, in part because, voters are going to have to sort of affirmatively go out and seek out one of those applications, and because there's no online method for requesting one, and because once they get one, they're going to have to get those signatures on it. That'll shrink the number, and we actually have some data, so or at least anecdotal data. There have been a number of special elections this summer, and there was a special election to fill the vacancy on the Providence City Council created when Sabina Matos became our lieutenant governor. And a whole host of voters in that special election forgot to get those witness or notary signature. And so, for people who do request mail ballots, they were able to vote 4 times last year and into this year with the March bond referendum without having to have those witnesses or notary. And now we've gone back to that, and they're going to be submitting their ballots without those, and then those votes might not be counted.
And in terms of voter registration, kind of what is our current landscape, and how does that compare with other states?
Yeah, so Rhode Island's pretty good at voter registration. We passed in 2016. Well, in 2015, we passed online voter registration, which has become almost ubiquitous across the country, and is very helpful for people updating their registration. And then in 2016, we passed what's called automatic voter registration, meaning when you go to the DMV, you are opted in to registering to vote unless you affirmatively choose to opt out. And that both increases the number of registrants, and because the DMV transactions capture address changes, that keeps the voter file cleaner. Rhode Island has not historically had a very clean voter file. We've had quite a bit of bloat, meaning people who have moved but didn't cancel their registration or left on the rolls. And during the pandemic, as I said, the Secretary of State sent applications to every registered voter. The information they get back, her office gets back from the post office about address changes or undeliverable mail, that can be used to update the voter file. And so we're going to come out of the pandemic with an opportunity to kind of once in a generation clean up the voter file and make it much more accurate, get what's called the deadwood off of the voter file. So there is a silver lining for cleaning the voter file from the pandemic. It takes a while because there's a federal law that says you can't move a voter to what's called an inactive voter until they haven't voted in 2 federal elections. So it's going to take 4 years, but eventually we're going to have a much cleaner voter file.
And so that's kind of the current state if nothing changes. But there's a coalition of organizations in Rhode Island that are advocating for some updating of the system in light of what worked in 2020. So do you want to talk about what is on the docket right now?
Yeah, so last year, Common Cause had led a coalition called the Rhode Island Voting Access Coalition. It was about a dozen groups, and it had worked on those reforms earlier, right? Automatic voter registration, online voter registration, and then we'd pushed for early voting for a couple of years, but it was not too active a coalition. And then last year, when the pandemic hit, the coalition sort of got more involved, pushing election administrators to make a number of concessions to voters to make the different forms of voting more accessible, early voting, mail balloting, knowing that we needed to take the stress off of election day, right? Because you can't have a crowded room during the pandemic. And so we got a lot of concessions last year, but only one of them was permanent. And that was, making that emergency mail balloting more like real early voting. Everything else was temporary. It was either done by the Secretary of State or the Board of Elections or the governor using emergency powers. So this coalition, which has grown to almost 30 groups, we launched a campaign at the beginning of this legislative session called Let RI Vote. And the idea was to take a lot of those practices from the pandemic, make them permanent, but don't stop there. Go further and say, okay, what are the best practices, right? So one example is mail ballot drop boxes. So everybody may have seen, every city and town hall in the state now has a beautiful stainless steel mail ballot drop box that is permanent, that was paid for by the state using some CARES Act money. And those are going to be there, right? But what do states that primarily vote by mail do? Well, they don't just have one per community. So Little Compton has one, Providence has one. That's not equitable. And so, our legislation, which is called the Let RI Vote Act, not only says, let's make those drop boxes permanent, but let's index them to population and require that they be spread throughout the community. So we want to have one drop box per 20,000 registered voters in the community so that larger communities, have a series of drop boxes spread around the community, which is more equitable for a voter who wants to vote by mail. They don't have to go to the drop box behind City Hall, for instance, in Providence, or the one at City Hall in Warwick, and so the Let RI Vote Act, which is bill number H6003 and S516, it's a comprehensive, or what we'd call an omnibus bill, that sort of from beginning to end, like, redoes Rhode Island election laws. One thing to keep in mind, Rhode Island, I mentioned at the beginning, 93% of voters historically vote in person in Rhode Island on election day. That is one of the highest percentages in the United States. Over the last 40 years, most states are migrating away from that, particularly states that aren't in New England. And New England has largely clinged to election day voting. And, as a result, we're putting more stress on that day. So what we're trying to do with the Let RI Vote Act is spread it among 20 days of early voting and mail ballots, and give voters that choice to vote the way they want to, and then the system tends to work better. And it's not just about increasing access; it's also about security. So, for instance, requiring our bill would require that the local boards of canvassers who are in charge of cleaning the voter rolls, they do that every quarter. Right now, they just do that at most once a year under the law. So let's, not only increase access for voters, but let's, use best practices for those who run our elections to make sure that they're, doing what they need to do to keep voter rolls clean and things like that. Another great example, during the pandemic, the Secretary of State created a bilingual voter information hotline. Had, I think, almost 3,000 calls. She worked with United Way's 211 system. That was great. Doesn't exist in law, isn't required for 2022 or 2024. That's in the bill to require that to be permanent, because it was a great idea. And we're going to have a new Secretary of State in 2.5 years, and so let's make sure these things are sort of in the law, so that the new Secretary of State has to provide them, just like the current one has.
And what's the status of that package of bills?
Yeah, so the General Assembly did a lot this session. They did nothing on voting rights. There were, I think, 82 bills on elections and campaign finance. They passed five, four of which were duplicates. So they really only passed 3 bills on elections, and none of them had anything to do with voting rights or expanding access to the ballot. So the Assembly has gone on vacation for the summer. They say they're coming back in September. The sponsors of the bill, Senator Don Oyer in the Senate and Representative Katie Kazarian in the House, have said, things are still alive. Maybe things will pass in September. So we're continuing to advocate for them to take this up in September. And that's incredibly important because you don't make election changes in election years, right? So you don't want to build the plane while you're flying the plane. And next year is a big election year. We have open races for governor. Well, actually, sorry, not open anymore with Dan McKee, but there'll be a big primary for governor. But, Secretary of State, General Treasurer, Lieutenant, she'll run as well. So we went from having 4 of the 5 general officers open to 2 of the 5, but because of term limits. But it'll be a big election next year. And we don't want to make these changes next year. We want to make them so that voters can get used to them. As I said, we've already have evidence that voters got used to not having to provide the witness signatures or notary signature. And we don't want that to disenfranchise people.
And so what would be the timeline if this bill was to pass? When would that happen? Or when does advocacy need to happen?
Yeah, so it continues during the summer. Normally we kind of take the summer off, but from advocacy. But this campaign, and you can find out more information. Our website's letrivote.org, and all the social media handles are Let RI Vote. And, we're continuing that over the summer, right? So we had an event on the 15th with about 60 activists, giving them this sort of update and asking them to reach out to their legislators. We're doing an in-person organizing meeting on the 28th. We're doing some canvassing, door knocking in August, and we're going to continue to push the legislature, in part because our inaction in Rhode Island stands in pretty sharp contrast to our neighboring New England states. So Connecticut just made some huge changes to automatic voter registration. Connecticut needs to pass a constitutional amendment to allow early voting, and they put that on the ballot. Massachusetts just passed, they kind of made the pandemic changes permanent for the rest of this year for local elections, and they're poised to do it permanently for all elections later this year. Vermont completely changed their voting system. They're going to do the Colorado model and send everybody a mail ballot from here on out. Maine made a bunch of huge changes. So we're very much an outlier in New England when it comes to voting access. And then even regionally, New York, which has often been the worst state in the Northeast, made big gains this year. So we're kind of lagging behind. And because New England and the Northeast had lagged behind the rest of the country, that means Rhode Island falls even further behind the whole United States. We're going to be really one of the most backward states when it comes to voting in the country.
And can you just talk a little bit about what's happening? And people are seeing on the news that President Biden and Vice President Harris are talking about voting rights, the issues in Texas. So if you can just talk a little bit about where things stand right now in terms of federal legislation about voting rights.
Yeah, so the states, the U.S. Constitution gives the states control over elections, but the federal government still retains control or the ability to pass legislation that affects federal elections. So, good examples of that are the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Help America Vote Act of 2003, where there has been legislation at the federal level that's affected how states run elections. In the absence of any federal legislation, though, states can do what they want. And so we see, generally speaking, blue states, excepting Rhode Island, kind of going toward increasing access, as well as purple states like Colorado, Arizona, and red states, some of which are constricting access. So the Georgias, the Texases have been sort of rolling back even some of the things that some of the access they already have. But what's interesting is some of those states even have better access than Rhode Island. Georgia has far more early voting than Rhode Island has ever had, and they're paring it back, and it's still going to be more early voting than Rhode Island. Texas is going to restrict early voting as well. Harris County, Texas had been doing 24-hour voting, which was incredibly popular because people coming off of swing shifts, and they're rolling that back. Rhode Island, like 24-hour voting, that's just a dream. So there is federal legislation, two big pieces. One is H1 and S1. Those are the congressional bill numbers. It's called the For the People Act. It is a huge, comprehensive bill, 800 pages, everything from requiring automatic voter registration, requiring early voting, requiring states to do a lot of things, to some campaign finance and ethics and other changes. And then the other one is called S4 and H4, and it's called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is one of the two big pieces of legislation from the civil rights movement, has been gutted by the Supreme Court. So in 2013, Section 5 of that was gutted. And then just a couple of weeks ago, in the last day of the term, the Supreme Court really set back Section 2 of that, which is unfortunate. And so that would update the Voting Rights Act and presumably, put it in line with sort of the Constitution, at least according to the majority of the Supreme Court. So those are big, important pieces, but we really kind of can't wait for that to happen. The Senate filibuster is there, and it's hard to overcome, and the state can do it itself. We have some of those things already, like automatic voter registration. But if S1, H1 were to pass, we'd actually have to do a lot because we're behind.
And one component of For the People Act is about redistricting. And so can you talk a little bit about that, where that stands in Rhode Island and the federal legislation?
Yeah, so redistricting happens every 10 years. That's why we all got involved in the census, right? They count everybody so that they can put them into districts. And this is the year it has to happen. And it's late because the census was delayed because of the pandemic. So the redistricting data, where we know, where people live, that comes out on August 16th or sooner. So in the next month, we're going to find that out. And that process is controlled by the states. So the state legislatures get to divide the districts both for Congress and for themselves, for the state legislature. S1, H1 would require independent commissions that aren't composed of the politicians themselves to draw at least the congressional maps.
Sorry about that technical glitch. John, if you can just finish what you're talking about with redistricting. So there's redistricting in the Let the People Act and also coming up for Rhode Island.
Yeah, so in the next month, the process will begin in Rhode Island, and it's too late to reform it, but there is going to be an opportunity for people to get involved. The redistricting commission created by our legislature will take public testimony, and the great thing is that this cycle, meaning this 10 years, the computers have gotten so much better that people are going to be able to draw their own maps of their communities and take them to the officials drawing the official maps and say, please don't divide my community. So there are a number of public websites, such as one is called District R, it's just the word district and the letter R, .org, where you can actually go and draw districts that you could then, or even just communities, not whole districts, and take it to the redistricting officials and say, please, draw the districts so they don't divide my community. And that's what groups like Common Cause are encouraging people to do. So we'll be doing a series of trainings for people about how to use that website and then how to testify before this commission and press them to keep communities whole.
And ultimately, the goal is to have independent redistricting commissions.
Yeah, so the gold standard is really take it out of the hands of the people who benefit the most. So the benefit of redistricting for the voter is there, but it's diffused among all the voters in the district. For a politician, that affects them a lot, right? So allowing the politicians to draw their own district is really just kind of fundamental conflict of interest. It means that the politicians are picking their voters rather than the other way around. So that's what we'd like. We'd like a California-style commission or an Arizona-style commission where somebody other than the politicians who've been screened so that they don't have conflicts do the map drawing.
And Common Cause has proposed legislation about that locally.
We have. It takes an amendment to the state constitution, and those tend to be hard to achieve, although we've done it 5 times in our history as an organization. But you have to build over years. So this is a longer term project for us. We started talking about it about 2 years ago. We anticipate people will become very educated about the process in the next 12 months as the state goes through it. And then we can continue to build for the next cycle.
Great. Now, funders as individuals can certainly advocate and write to their legislators about the different legislation package coming up hopefully in the fall. So that is one option. And I believe there's something on your website that if as an individual they wanted to write, isn't there a bot or something on your?
Yeah, so we have a series of tools to help people advocate on behalf of the voting rights package. So it's actually at the Let RI Vote website, so letrivote.org. We use Action Network, which is just a way to funnel people to contact their legislators. So you can go there and send a letter to your legislator or legislators, state legislators, urging them to sign the bill. But most people who are hearing this probably are more politically active in some ways and know their state legislators already, and just that personal outreach makes a huge difference. There are a lot of issues competing for the attention of the legislature, and voting rights needs to break through. I think a lot of people just assume, well, we're Rhode Island, it's a blue state, everything's okay with voting rights, and they don't realize that we're falling further and further behind. There are concrete things that we know work based on the experience of 2020 that could increase turnout.
And organizationally, GCRI is a 501c3. We have 501c3 foundations as well as funders who only fund 501c3 activities, so nonpartisan, non-political activities. So how, if they are concerned about these issues, what kind of activities are okay for 501c3, either the funder themselves being a 501c3 or funding 501c3 activities?
Yeah, so many of the groups involved in voting rights both have 501c3s in addition to 501c4s that we use to fund our education and outreach work, not necessarily our advocacy work. So for instance, Common Cause has an education fund. We use it to fund what we call election protection. So on election day, we deployed about 120 volunteers around the state to stand outside of polling places with literature in multiple languages to assist voters, not to campaign, just to assist them if they have any questions about the voting process. And that's backed up by a hotline that they can call if they need to talk to an attorney because they're being denied their right to vote. It's all 501c3 activity, right? It's not lobbying, it's just educating voters about their right to cast their ballot. There is other work, and the League of Women Voters, the ACLU, some of the groups, for whom voting rights is not a central issue, but a peripheral issue that are involved in the work, also have 501c3s. And so you can support those groups, right? Because particularly outside the three groups I mentioned, there's not a lot of capacity. So there's a group called Arise, which helps represent youth from the Southeast Asian population, and they have like a 5-hour-a-week organizer working on this stuff. And they just don't have a lot of capacity, but they want to engage in the work. And so in Rhode Island, in particular, just doesn't have a lot of capacity around the whole sort of voting rights, but civic participation, ecosystem. And then there is redistricting work that is C3 work. So as I said, Common Cause is going to encourage people just to draw their maps of their communities. That is not lobbying. That is just educating people about the process of redistricting and how it affects them, and encouraging them to sort of speak up and show what their community means to them. And that's all 501c3 work. And you had a great panel earlier this year that showed how other similar organizations to GCRI are funding that work in other states like Arizona, because that is, if you think about it, it's really an extension of the census work, right? The census work was about standing up for your community, and then the redistricting work is just standing up to explain what your community looks like to the rest of the state, because communities aren't just municipal boundaries or neighborhood boundaries. There are communities within communities that none of us are aware of, but the members are aware, that they're a part of the community. And redistricting is a chance for them to express that, so that they then get fair political representation. And it's a once-in-a-decade chance, so it's really important.
Great. This is really helpful, John. I think that it really helped funders to think through just kind of what the landscape is, how it affects organizations and individuals that they care about, communities that they have invested in, and how Rhode Island ties in with the national landscape. So thanks so much for taking the time. And if you have additional questions, I will include John's contact information as well, so that you can reach out to him directly and probe his expert brain on all of this stuff. So thanks so much, John.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Nancy.
Oops.